Welcome at this program of Studium Generale. My name is Lucas Asselbergs. I'm head of the Bureau Studium Generale. Today we are going to talk about other very important challenges, and that's maybe also the reason why there are so many of you present in this hall for this lecture that we have today. We are dealing with geopolitics and with our energy supply, and we will see that these two are intertwined in a very intricate way. And we have invited a speaker who has been working for Shell, for the Royal Shell, for 2 decades. And after that, she focused on studies in renewables, in the new energy forms, and works for the Hague Strategic Studies. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Lucia van Geuns. A warm round of applause.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you can hear me well. Actually, I didn't only work on renewables. I also work still on gas and oil. So that's actually what we're going to talk about, unfortunately, today. We're going to talk about the global energy crisis and, of course, specifically also Europe and what it actually will mean for the next 10 years, especially in relations to the energy transition. So before I'm going to show what I'm going to tell you sort of in 20 minutes or 25 minutes, let's first sort of look at the energy world from a helicopter point of view. First of all, the energy transition at large. I mean, if there's one slide I would like you to remember at this particular lecture, is that energy transitions are unpredictable and they take time. And we have seen that in the past. And I reckon it will not be different for the energy transition we are currently in. On top of that, from an international energy transition point of view, there is no one-size-fits-all. It very much depends on where you live in the world, whether you live in China, whether you live in sub-Saharan Africa, in Europe, or in the United States. The energy transition will be different, and it will be different also in terms of pace, in terms of time. Wind and solar energy definitely will grow rapidly, and it already happens, and it will only grow more fast. However, the world's reliance on fossil fuels in the next decades isn't changing that fast as we maybe hope. And let me give you a bit of an example by at least look at the perspective from a historic point of view. This is a graph from the International Energy Agency, which is an OECD organization based in Paris. And here you can actually see what has happened in the last roughly 100 years. Look at the amount of energy we used in 1919. And this is in million tons of oil equivalent. And look also at the energy mix, which was in fact dominated by traditional biomass and coal. Remember, we came from the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 19th century, and coal was very much used in order to, especially in Europe and the United States, fuel our rapidly growing economy. Then if we fast forward towards where we roughly are now, and you see the actual energy mix, and mind you, an energy mix, I mean the primary energy we are using in order to fuel our economy, you see that actually the energy mix is now far more diverse, but the bulk of the energy mix is made up by fossil fuels, which is coal, gas, and oil. And that's given here by these colors. And actually 90 or 80% of the energy mix is made up of fossil fuels. Still a little bit of traditional biomass, some very little bit is now, if you like, renewable biomass. And then, of course, we have nuclear, yellow here, and then modern renewables, which is only a small part still of the energy mix as we see it today. And surely we would like towards 2050, or 2040 given here, but 2050, same, we like to go to an energy mix which is even more diverse, but should actually be dominated by renewable energy. It remains to be seen whether that actually is going to happen. What is most important on this graph is that you see that the last century saw multiple transitions. So it went from coal to gas, it went from, if you like, biomass, traditional biomass, but also horsepower towards transport, which is fueled by oil and oil products. And at the same time, you see that now we try to make this, if you like, step towards renewable energy. So it was multiple transitions to different fuels based on different technologies and different technology breakthroughs. Take, for instance, nuclear energy. And another, and that's also something which I would like you to remember from this particular lecture, is that the challenge today is one of scale. Look at the amount of energy we used at the beginning of last century and the amount of energy we're using now. 10 times more than at the beginning of last century. So global energy use is 10 times higher than in 1919, and it's still growing. And mind you, of course, the growth of energy demand is very much fueled by economic growth, but also by demographics. You all know that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we had around 1 billion people on this globe. I often say that when I was born, there were 3 billion people on this globe. Now, and you all know, because you all read it in the newspapers in the last 2 weeks, we have just passed the 8 billion people border, if you like. We are now here with 8 billion persons. It's a challenge, I would say, especially because obviously we are with so many and we all like to live like you and me are living currently in the world. So what I would like to do in the next now remaining almost 20 minutes, I like to look at the risk of a disorderly transformation, the current energy crisis, of course, so we look at gas, but also the upcoming oil boycott in the European Union, and actually then a couple of slides on what we experience now with respect to the shifting geopolitical landscape. Okay, well, this is probably a report which you all have seen, maybe even have read. It's a very thick report. It's a report which was actually for free downloadable from the International Energy Agency website. And this was the Net Zero by 2050 report. A scenario, a backcasting scenario from the International Energy Agency who says, listen, we can reach 2050, be net zero as far as our emission is concerned. And this was being issued in May 2021. And a lot of papers actually had front page news and says the only way to actually establish this is by not investing anymore in oil and gas in the whole world. It also says that the path to net zero emissions is narrow and that we have to drive huge leaps in order to actually use and also manage all this clean energy innovation, a rapid shift away from fossil fuels. In fact, we should use much, much less as we do now, at the same time also not invest. Electricity will become the core of the energy system. And of course, when you have invested and when you actually are using low emissions industry, that will flourish. That will be, if you like, your employer of the future. But also here, look at this particular point, a clean energy world where we will be at 2050 in this particular scenario. Solar will be the single largest source of supply. Close cooperation between businesses, investors and citizens, very, very important. And then that last point is very important as well. We should internationally cooperate, maybe much more than we are doing now in a globalized world. But actually, are we not making a step backwards with respect to this international cooperation among countries? And let me try to illustrate that now where we are. Of course, we like to, from all the COPs we have done, so the climate conferences from the United Nations, the one last year in Glasgow and the one this year in Egypt, which of course was not such a success, but last year at least all the major consumers of energy, being China, of course, now, very important, and traditionally the United States, the European Union, but in this case also India as an upcoming emerging economy, and Russia as a big energy producer, if you like. They issued their pledges. That's what they call their pledges in order to meet net zero by certain dates. And of course, we know in the US and the European Union it's 2050. That's our date. The Green Deal, as far as the European Union is concerned, and also, especially now under President Biden, a lot of effort is made, especially with respect to infrastructure, in order to meet this 2050 target, where at least we should have far less emissions also in the interim goal in 2030. China, of course, very important, but it actually just started only the last 20 years with emitting a lot of CO2. So they actually think they will be carbon neutral by 2060. So this at least has been decided. This is different than the net zero scenario I just showed from the International Energy Agency. This, in fact, is one of the scenarios which the International Energy Agency has given in their World Energy Outlook, the new pledges scenario, and then you have the net zero carbon scenario. But then, of course, you have also other scenarios. You have, well, call it the business as usual scenario, or at least the scenarios where only policies are implemented as they have been defined at this moment in time. And if you really look at those scenarios of the World Energy Outlook, and I would recommend to do that if you're interested in the subject, you will see that actually energy security and the risk of a disorderly change have also been described this time by the Energy Agency, simply because on the 25th of February, obviously something happened. And we see that energy security became very much at the forefront, while in fact the years before, especially in the EU, but also in the US, green growth was very much in the forefront. What actually the World Energy Outlook said, and this has been issued in November last year, they say that scenarios often describe a smooth and orderly process of change, but in practice it's far more volatile, it's far more disjointed, and on top of that it is very much characterized by competing interests and stop-go policies. You can even see it on our small territory called the Netherlands. A lot of stop-go policies as far as, for instance, climate is concerned, but also energy in general. So you see there is there's a risk in the next decades of a mismatch between energy supply and demand. That has to do with investment, I already talked about that, different signals, again, depending on where you live in the world, insufficient technological progress, poorly designed policies, and especially infrastructure. Extremely important. There will be, and there are already, disjoint, or if you like, bottlenecks in the infrastructure. We see that also in the Netherlands. Take, for instance, the amount of solar energy which people would like to emerge, but there is simply no possibility to connect it to, for instance, the large-scale scheme of things which TenneT is responsible for. This particular slide may be a bit complicated, but this shows the problems which might emerge with respect to investments. What you see here is the net zero scenario, but then in the next 10 years, this is the amount of money which is being invested in the past and which is invested, seen to be invested in the next decade. And here you see it with respect to, on the left-hand side is oil and gas, and on the right-hand side it is renewable energy. And it's interesting how the International Energy Agency, from which this particular graph is, how this has been framed. They say as far as oil and gas is concerned, we are very much moving towards a world, which actually is called zero carbon. In other words, you see that there is less investment in oil and gas in the last 5 years. So in fact, that was good news, and that's at least how it's been framed. If you look here at the clean energy and the infrastructure investment done for instance, in the next 10 years, or predicted to be done in the next 10 years, you see there is still a lot to be done in terms of the amount of investment which need to be done in order to reach at least an intermittent target here in 2030. So oil and gas investment is geared to a world of stagnant and falling demand. That is at least what has been assumed, while transition-related spending is not rising nearly fast enough. You can also translate it and say, well, actually too little is being invested at this moment in time in oil and gas. And that might eventually give, in the next 10 years, quite a problem. Simply because there will not be enough, depending on demand, and simply also because there are certain areas, like for instance we have now in Europe, there is not enough gas, and that has everything to do, of course, with the current problem in Ukraine, and I'll come back to that. So this is just a way to frame things, but there is a looming risk of more turbulence on the energy markets, only, if you like, even based on this particular graph. And then if we go back to the basics, when you talk about energy policy, surely it has to be a balance. A balance between what we call affordability, so the economy, how much the price of energy, security, very, very important in this day and age, and whether it's sustainable enough. And it depends very much also where you live in the world, how much emphasis is being put on these, if you like, 3 end members. The United States of America, already since 40 years, put a lot of emphasis on security. A lot of presidents, whether they're Democratic or whether they're Republicans, they always said, listen, we are addicted to oil and we become more and more dependent on unstable parts of the world. That's what actually all American presidents had said in their State of the Union, but not anymore. because the United States of America is now producing a lot of gas themselves, a lot of coal themselves, they're nuclear independent, and also as far as oil is concerned, they produce a lot themselves, so that that dependency relation is far less. And even Obama, in his last State of the Union, didn't actually mention that particular sentence I just said. Here in Europe, sustainability is extremely important, but meanwhile, we became more and more dependent on oil and gas import. Oil already for a long time, and gas, of course, in the last 15 years, very much dependence with respect to the Russian Federation. So, and then, of course, 24th of February 2022. We see a roller coaster oil market in terms of volatility of the price. After that particular date, you see a perfect storm with respect to global gas markets, with prices which were spiking. And then, of course, on the power market, also a lot of vulnerability, given that we want to move away from, if you like, gas-fired power stations to more renewable electricity. But that, of course, in the end of the day, gives problems with respect to security and also with our ideas on cutting emissions. So what has happened? Just very, very short, and I'm sure you are very much aware of it. This is 2001, this is where we are now. This is the Russian invasion in Ukraine, 24th of February. Look, the dependency, this is the amount of, the market share of Russian gas into Europe, and especially into the European Union. You see that was sort of roughly 30% import dependence. And mind you, we were already import dependent since it was the Soviet Union. All the pipelines run from east to west. Infrastructure has been invested already for a long time. Look here, after the annexation of the Crimea, you see actually an increase of dependency with respect to gas. This is a picture from the International Energy Agency. And here, actually, you see in 2001, there was this artificial scarcity which was created by Gazprom, and we all sleepwalked further in Europe. And then 24th of February, all of a sudden we thought, oh my God, we are so dependent on Russia. And Russia is doing something which we don't like, aggressive towards Ukraine, and in the end of the day, Putin can do strange things. Well, we thought as Europe, we're going to do something first. We're going to set a new policy called Repower EU, and we want to become at least 66% less dependent on gas at the end of this year. Well, there we are in December. At the moment, the amount of import dependency on Russia is 8%. And that's not because Europe has done a lot. No, because Putin has gradually sort of block the amount of export towards Europe, starting with Bulgaria, then in the end of the day other smaller countries, and then later also the Nord Stream 1, which is so important for gas towards especially Germany. And here's a remark which I made. Also Groningen, obviously at that moment in time, it was decided to close Groningen, the largest gas field in northwestern Europe, and that turned out badly for security of supply, for affordability, but also for the climate. Groningen was a flexible producer in the last 20 years, if you like. Now it's a volume producer, and actually it's hardly producing any gas anymore. So that's why the Netherlands became, since 2018, import dependent on gas, and therefore also import dependent on gas coming from Russia. So just to give you some feeling on all these export pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and 2, the Yamal pipeline, the pipeline through Ukraine, where still some gas is flowing through, and then of course the pipeline through the Black Sea, where also still some gas is flowing through. And there's also still some LNG coming from the Arctic, which is here, and that's actually coming into Gate, which is the LNG terminal here in Rotterdam. So that is actually still flowing as far as gas import is concerned. And then, of course, we also see that the gas price gradually went up, and this is not new to you. This is the TTF, which is the spot market here in Amsterdam. Here you see actually towards January 2022, it already went up because of this gradual, if you like, sabotage from Gazprom. And here you actually see that actually the price, and here you see that in large, the price even in August went to 364 euro per megawatt hour, which is absolutely unbelievable. And you talk about hundreds of dollars per barrel, if equivalent when you talk about oil terms. Now it's much lower, yes, because actually we have filled all our gas storages. Because the reason why this was so high, because we were really sort of afraid that this winter it would be very cold in Europe, but also in the Netherlands. So we tried to fill up as much as we could the gas storages, and they're filled up. They're actually filled up in most of the European Union, and that's the good news. But it's still gas which we got from Russia. Next spring, next summer, it will be a different case, simply because we have to fill up these gas storages, not anymore with gas from Russia, because there's not any gas coming anymore. So, to recap on the gas markets, and I'm aware of the time, the Russian invasion of Ukraine redefines the global natural gas markets. And why does it redefine it? Because actually the gas market becomes now much more of a world market and not a regional market dependent on pipelines. And the world markets means LNG, liquefied natural gas. The high price and tight supply that built up in the second half of 2021, as I told you, went further intensified after the invasion, and that was leading, if you like, towards what we call fuel switching and demand destruction. And demand destruction, you can actually also say more positively, which meant that we are much more safe, we are much more efficient with respect to gas, and at the same time you see that we actually have switched from gas-fired power stations to coal-fired power stations, which, for instance, from a green point of view, of course, bad news. But crisis, in the end of the day, made even our, if you like, green minister, like Mr. Jette, decide to eventually let the coal-fired power stations on for still a while in order to keep the lights on. And in the EU, yes, we like to phase out the Russian import, and we like to transform the gas market, but that takes time. And it has very much effect on the global gas dynamics, because far more LNG has to come into Europe, while in fact it came, especially since last year, mainly towards Asia, because that's where the LNG market was thriving. And there's even a possibility that Russia will unilaterally decide to even that 8% gas import which is still coming into Europe, or the LNG streams, are even to stop that as well. Okay, well, so far, well, this is probably a picture you've seen. This is from Bloomberg, and you see that the US LNG export has now actually overtaken the Russia as far as being the major importer of gas. So US LNG is now bigger than last year Russian import was in the European Union. Very, very short on Gasunie, simply because Gasunie actually is an infrastructure company, of course, a state company in Europe, and it actually made at least the infrastructure and the dynamics such that this winter, most likely, everything will be sort of hunky-dory, as far as, you know, our gas, as far as our energy is concerned in the Netherlands. So the study assumed, though, an average winter, and actually that total gas import will stop, and it has not happened yet. But all in all, our gas storages are filled. We got far more LNG coming, for instance, not only through Gate in Rotterdam, but also through new floating LNG terminals, etc., etc. Coal-fired power stations, I already mentioned, they continue to run at full capacity. Well, we also like to actually produce more gas ourselves out of the North Sea, and the minister actually would like to fasten, if you like, the whole permissions. That actually is not happening yet, but let's hope it's going to. And at the same time, as I said, 2 new LNG terminals are now in the Eemshaven in order to both store and also eventually trade gas also to Germany. So just some words on oil. How much do I still have? 5 minutes? Okay. Okay, on oil markets, the verdict is out. The oil market actually, as far as where we are now, is not suffering too much on what we would call the EU maritime boycott, which is set for the 5th of December, which is Monday, for crude oil and only maritime oil, and also for oil products on the 5th of February next year. And mind you, we in Europe, but also the Netherlands, is very dependent on import from crude oil, but also oil products from Russia, more than 25%. The oil price has not suffered too much, also because we have a problem in China. China probably has quite a lot of demand destruction because of the ongoing COVID measures, and therefore luckily, actually, I would say the oil price is not that high as you might eventually think. But there is great uncertainty and there is a lot of price volatility. And also what you see already, because don't forget on the sixth sanction package of the EU in June said that we should boycott the Russian oil, simply to, if you like, hit the amount of income coming from the EU towards Russia. But you see new patterns of trade flow. You see Russian crude oil now moving far more towards the east, for instance, India and China rather than Europe, and also the Middle East. And you see far more US crude, but also North Sea crude and Middle Eastern crude moving towards Europe. On the other hand, we have a diesel problem because it's a different type of oil. So there we might have a problem which is upcoming. New trade practices, I will not go into any detail here, but there's a lot of blending going on and ship-to-ship transfer from Russian oil, in other tankers, etc., etc. What is important is, of course, this pipeline running actually through Europe, which is the Druzhba pipeline. That is being excluded from the boycott, simply because otherwise Central European countries will have problems with generating oil products. So especially Hungary, of course, a sort of semi-friend of Mr. Putin, very much debated this in Brussels, that they would be excluded from this particular boycott. And of course, financing Putin's war, this is what it is all about. We like to actually impose these boycotts simply to hit, if you like, the military income or the revenues which are being used for military purposes. Just to give you an idea, oil and gas-related taxes and export tariffs amount to around 40% of the federal budget of the Russian Federation, and also we have seen that historically correlating towards a regular military exposure. Here you see actually the amount of oil now moving all the way to India and China rather than staying in the European Union. And this is a heat map made for that purpose. And just to give an idea, and I'm not going to a lot of detail, look at how much Putin has earned simply by exporting oil and gas. And mind you, although he's exporting less, especially with respect to gas, the price is much higher. So effectively, for instance, for the European Union, more than $117 billion have been sorry, this is actually euros, have been exported to Russia simply for the oil and gas and a little bit of coal export. In total, 230 billion. And look at the country. This is since the start of the war. And look at the countries. I mean, China, yes, number one, especially with respect to oil, crude oil. But look here, Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey, Italy, Poland, very, very important countries in order to feed, if you like, the Putin's war machine. But then, of course, there are always shifts. There are maybe winners and there are losers, and maybe one of the winners, as far as being an energy superpower, is the United States of America. Now it actually is number one gas importer in the European Union. It is a big exporter in energy in general, and while China, another, if you like, big energy importer, is very heavily dependent on all sorts of imports, except maybe coal. So the US, largest producer of oil today, largest exporter of gas, especially LNG, and the largest exporter of LNG, as said. And that has everything to do with technology. It's about shale. It's about the shale technology. I will not go into any detail, but of course also LNG, which the US has very much built their, if you like, their export machine on. Well, then I have two other slides, and that is to do with the, if you like, the geopolitical implication. If you look at history, I have the feeling that we are now at a crossroad. And that has to do with the end of a 30-year period after the Iron Curtain collapse. And then we're talking about the early 90s. You see, an end of time of open markets and globalization. We actually are back to a far more divided world. You actually also see that the Western world, and especially Europe, has slammed the door towards Russia. And I don't think that will actually change very, very, very soon. And on top of that, if you look at the WTO, the World Trade Organization consensus, that seems to be also suffering, given that we are now in an era of great power competition and strategic collaboration. Look here, for instance, the G7 meeting in June this year. So it looks like we are at the start of a world of fragmentation rather than cooperation. And what does that mean for the European Union? Yes, it has to get its act together, in the sense that there should be a new energy order. In other words, we should be less dependent on Russia, and we should be far more autonomous, which is very, very difficult when you talk about oil and gas, because we can only do that, go to this new normal by diversifying much of our energy sources. That's what we're doing now, by getting LNG from everywhere. Qatar, just to mention a country, or Azerbaijan, or Algeria. Well, I mean, we can talk about that, but interesting countries. Acceleration of renewable energy sources, very, very important, but we're simply not there yet. Concerns about energy security, and of course we all realize that the transition will be long and bumpy. And in 2030, yes, we hope we're going to reduce 55% of our CO2 emissions, but let's hope that it's going to happen. And then you see that actually we are still dependent on hydrocarbons. So energy security remains at the heart of energy policy, especially now, and the transition to a new energy order will not be smooth or orderly, especially because we have major players who have all kind of, if you like, turbulence going on, US, Taiwan, China, but also, of course, we and Russia, and slowing down of globalization and upcoming recession. I don't have a nice story, unfortunately. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that very eloquent and informative address. I think it's a lot of information, but the good news is we recorded it all, so you can look it back. So it would be really tough to do an exam about all this this material, but it's really wonderful to have this overview. My first question would be, are you really in favor of reopening the gas fields in Groningen, as it seemed in your presentation?
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be the case, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think from a political point of view, in the Netherlands at least, that is a no-go. Unless there is a real security supply issue, and I think upcoming winter that will not be the case. Maybe next winter, and then it should really be a demand coming from the European Union. Because it is something, when there is a clear security supply problems, and we have problems with turning the lights on in hospitals, etc., then maybe this is an issue, and this can be considered. And that's what also State Secretary Velbrief has said. But it is a balance between what's currently happening in Groningen with the earthquakes and what's happening in Northwest Europe with respect to gas. Yeah.
Okay. It's a matter of how far the crisis will go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions from the audience, please. We have room for one or two questions still. There's a finger in the back. A long throw there. Yes. Here we go. Marvelous throw. Marvelous catch.
Yeah, I had a question about sort of the demand side of the energy crisis. Do you think it might be a good idea for energy policy to sort of prioritize certain industries over others in terms of where the demand can go?
Yeah, a very good question, because of course I did not touch upon the deindustrialization, which is actually gradually going on in Europe, which is bad news for Europe. As if you like, a business model as far, but you see already industries leaving Europe simply because the energy price is so high for them, especially the energy-intensive industry, like aluminium smelters, but also take steel type of processing. I reckon it's extremely important to prioritize, who gets the energy, especially when you talk about it from an industry point of view, and who will not get the energy. And this is something which is, I think, still up in debate, because in fact you see the Green Deal in Europe and you see industry policies here side by side, but they should merge much more. This is a way to merge industry policy with, if you like, a climate and energy policy, both on European level, but also on say, Dutch level or national level. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Any other question?
Yeah. Sit down there.
Yeah, give it a try. Yeah. Okay.
So we want to be net zero by 2050. that means that you need to offset all the carbon emitted when burning, for example, fossil fuels. But then you need to capture all of it. What are the economics of capturing all the carbon that you emit?
Yeah, well, carbon capture and storage, is a technology which is there. And it's the best to actually capture that from a point source, a refinery or a fossil-fueled electricity power station, and then capture the CO2 and eventually, pipe it towards an old gas field, an old gas or oil field offshore. But it is not done in a very large manner yet. A little bit in the United States, a little bit in Canada, a little bit in Australia, but here in Europe it really should emerge. It's a very important technology in order to eventually reduce our CO2 emissions. But it has everything to do with the, whether governments are supporting it and also whether industry is wanting to do that, because it has a very difficult business model behind it, very difficult, it has very little earning power. So it depends very much on where you are. I think the Netherlands is very well positioned to do that. We have a lot of offshore fields which are already depleted as far as their oil and gas production is concerned. Another country is Norway, and Norway has recently concluded, if you like, that they need a large dump of CO2. They call that Northern Lights, and it is a cooperation between Equinor, Total Energy, Shell, and I think maybe one other. And there you can eventually put your CO2 in a ship or by pipeline, go to that particular dump, which is a very large depleted gas field or oil field, and there you can then dump literally your CO2, large scale. And of course, we have this project called Porthos here in the Rotterdam harbor. But unfortunately, Porthos, which was also, capturing CO2 from somewhere in the harbor, a point source, a refinery, and then with a pipeline, bring it into an old field. But unfortunately, now that's delayed because of what we call the nitrogen problem here in the Netherlands. So that eventually will slow down. But that might be the first big carbon capture and storage project here in the Netherlands. Yeah, definitely important, but it goes very slow.
All right, and one small follow-up question. Like gas contains much more volume. If you burn like 1 liter of fuel, then you have a lot of liters of gas. Mm-hmm. So you can't just refill all the gas storage with all the fuel storage with your gas, right?
Yeah, well, we have in the Netherlands, of course, 3 big gas storage facilities, which is Noord, Grijpskerk, and Bergermeer. And Bergermeer is a big commercial gas storage, and currently they're 90% full. So they are actually doing their job, and that has then been restored in wintertime.
No, I mean, like if you want to store CO2 in the earth, then a gas contains a lot more volume per rate.
Yeah. No,
so
sorry, I misunderstood.
Where are you going to store all the CO2 then?
Yeah. But there's also a possibility to store it in an aquifer. And there are large aquifers also in the North Sea. And that's already been done currently by Equinor, which is the Norwegian state oil company. And they are actually storing CO2 in a large aquifer, which do not find its way to the surface. So then it becomes, if you like, spaarwater. It becomes sort of bubbling water. And when it's a thick aquifer, then eventually you can store it in there. And then you have to monitor, of course, where it goes to. And they do that with 3D seismic. So yeah, there's a lot of work being done on that.
Okay,
yeah.
A lot to discuss still.
Yeah.
So after this program, you can come down and take the chance to raise some more questions, of course. I would like to round off this program with a nice round of applause for Lucia van Geuns. Thank you. That's a good applause. That's wonderful. So, in the meantime, you saw already this QR code. We are really looking forward to receive your feedback on our programs. It only takes 1 minute of your time. You can scan this one, or you will receive a questionnaire in your email box, and you would help us a lot. See you back at one of our Studium Generale programs. Check our website, and have a good day. Thank you very much.